Welcome to Global Perspectives. What are some of the partnerships that can help us navigate our increasingly turbulent world? For answers, we turn to Jennifer Clinton, President and CEO of Cultural Vistas.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Talk to us about partnerships, specifically the partnership that launched Cultural Vistas. A lot of people know the story, but many more don't.
Sure. So our organization is a nonprofit international exchange organization based in New York, Washington, and Berlin. And you think back to the 1920s was kind of the seed of the concept of our organization that was very much based on U.S.-German relations. And the CEO of Bayer Corporation, based in Germany at the time, saw, and this is back in the 1920s, saw a need, even pre-World War I and World War II, to provide work-based experiences for young professionals to come and learn about the U.S. business practices, the industrial economy that was so strong at the time, and then the idea for those participants to go back and continue their careers and bring this new knowledge that they had gained in the U.S. So fast forward now, 70 plus years, we're still building on that concept of providing young people, young professionals, opportunities to, whether it's Americans going abroad to learn about and build their global skills and understanding how to work in a different type of environment, as well as participants coming into the U.S. to do the same. It's just critically important opportunities for young people to develop their skills and build their networks.
Give us an example of how somebody would get into the opportunities provided by these exchanges and partnerships.
So we run about 30 different programs every year. So we are out talking about the programs on college campuses, recruiting participants, and we're pretty specific about the types of backgrounds that we're looking for. So for example, we have a long-standing program called the Congress Bundestag Young Professionals Exchange Program, and it's a program that's funded by the U.S. Department of State and the German Bundestag, and it provides opportunities for 75 Americans, young professionals between the ages of 18 and 24, and Germans of the same cohort to spend time in each other's countries. So there's a need to have an understanding of an interest in the German culture, some prior German language experience, and a willingness to really step outside of their comfort zone. So that program is an example of one that we, again, are out on campuses, advertising and encouraging participants to apply for it. Highly competitive, but we have a whole range of different opportunities similar to that people can go on our website, find out about it, and go through an application process.
I could see it would be probably maybe easier for somebody who's in his or her early 20s to apply for something like that than somebody who was 18 who may not be as familiar, as confident, and all of that. But there's really opportunity for everyone. So the younger person should not hesitate.
Yeah, that is true. And I have to say, more and more the profile of individuals who are taking opportunities to travel or study or work abroad, they're getting younger and younger. And so you're seeing now, kids that are in high school or coming out of high school that have had multiple international experiences that are positioning them for, even higher profile opportunities as they progress, even when they're 18, 19 years old. So that's, I would say a newish phenomenon over the last decade or so with all of these experiences that are available to people of all ages.
And those are generally structured learning experiences rather than vacation tourism type ones?
Absolutely. So we use the term experiential learning opportunities where we're providing students a work-based experience, so an internship essentially, and whether it's here in the U.S. or abroad, where we help them find an internship placement that is aligned with their academic studies and their academic goals. And within the internship experience, each of the individuals has a learning plan that they're working throughout the course of their internship. So it is very structured. It's important that they have a supervisor that's guiding them through that learning plan and are establishing goals and objectives for them that, again, helps them put into practice what they're learning in the classroom.
I'm obviously coming from a bias here, but I think every young person who has the desire and the opportunity to pursue an international experience of some kind should do so.
Absolutely.
And at the university level, I think it should be required. Of every student. But not everyone feels that way. Some are like Garfield, and it's like, oh, it's kind of a threatening world out there. I think I'll just go back to sleep. How do you inspire that person who may be a little bit reluctant to wander out into the world? It's a dangerous place. It seems to be getting scarier with each passing day. How do you persuade that person that it's okay, that it's going to be a good experience, and you will help yourself become part of the solution?
Right. So I think there's a lot of ways to come at it, and I look at a university like University of Central Florida that has a lot of international students that are here, and I think encouraging American students to connect with them, to learn from them, and to get comfortable with the idea of possibly spending time in their country. It just makes it more real, more human. So I think that's one way that, schools, whether it's high schools or universities, can really help foster that. I think another way is for those people that are more comfortable with taking those steps, when they come back as alumni of different types of programs, really utilizing them to talk in a very personal manner with potential students to share their experience and how they overcame some of the obstacles or the scariness of it. So I think, really pursuing a very personalized approach to getting people comfortable with it. And we're also seeing trends where there are more short-term opportunities for young people to go abroad. So a week-long or a 2-week volunteer opportunity. I've heard a lot of young people, particularly at the high school level, doing those experiences that give them a taste of wanting to spend even more time abroad. So I think there's a trajectory where you can build over time shorter term experiences that build up to maybe a semester, then to a year-long experience.
That was going to be my next question, so you sort of anticipated it, because I have found that oftentimes people don't have the time to go abroad for a semester or a year, but a very intensive short-term experience, and I do this on a regular basis with mostly professionals, practitioners, academics, some students from time to time, but we'll go to a country or a region for a 9-10 day experience where it is work. I mean, you of course tap into the culture and you have some breaks, but it's basically a 9 in the morning until 9 at night experience 7 days a week. And so in the course of that, you get about as much exposure to active learning as you would almost in a semester.
Absolutely.
And that's something that, in terms of time, is more manageable. Cost is very reasonable.
Yep.
And like you said, I'm glad to hear that that's becoming more and more a choice that people are making.
Definitely. And I think I was talking to a young student today who's in business school at UCF, and she has had now 4 short-term abroad experiences and testing out different regions of the world to find where she wants to develop her expertise from a regional perspective. And by having those kind of comparative experiences, it helps her focus on what's the long-term experience that she wants to have. So I'm really pleased to see that as a trend that's emerging.
Can you give us some short anecdotes about people who have been through these that are now in some positions of importance, authority, decision-making, sort of the longer-term success of one of these exchanges?
Sure. I'll give 2 examples. One, we've been working with the Bosch Foundation, which is the Bosch Corporation in Germany, one of the largest private foundations in Europe, who has been providing fellowship opportunities for Americans to spend a year in Germany studying the language, but also doing an internship or a consultancy in German companies. And the former Chief of Staff to President Obama, Dennis McDonough, was an alum of the Bosch Fellowship Program and feels very proud and connected and wanting to help others have those types of experiences. I also think about programs like the Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program, where currently we work on that program, and right now 30% of the world's leaders, from Theresa May to a wide range of former leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Nicolas Sarkozy, came through that international visitor program. And when they were in their 30s and early 40s, before they became and have taken those roles of very senior leadership. So the experiences that these individuals, whether it's Dennis McDonough or a Theresa May, those early experiences that they've had in international environments have really helped shape how they go about their work and how they integrate other perspectives into their work.
Tell us how you deal with the evolving world. We had a very stable period of time, maybe not stable for the best of reasons because of the East-West divide, but we had a very stable period of time. That came to an end. Cold War was over. And then we went into a rather tumultuous period of change. Things seemed to settle down. We had a good economy for a while. Then the economy turned sour, and we had some incidents, some tragic events, 9/11 among them, that changed people's perceptions of what was going on. And now a lot of people are just wondering, what's next? Is it going to become more complicated? How do you wake up thinking, oh, I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to fix this, we're going to be able to get through this?
So what I love about the work that we do and what international experiences help people develop is the skill of resilience and adaptability. And I think, we are not going to see an end of kind of a chaotic environment for probably decades to come, just because of how complex the world is and some of the trends that are happening from a geopolitical perspective. So I think what gives me hope is the fact of helping individuals really build that muscle of being adaptable and waking up with a hopeful perspective because they've pushed themselves outside their comfort zones in a way that they can be used to, embracing the chaos and kind of making sense out of it. And so I think that's what, we need to be doing as educators, is not trying to fix all the problems because they are so complex, but being able to live in that kind of environment and address them in ways where we can make progress, but knowing that it's just going to continue to be a very complex time and place we're living in.
Oftentimes people will see you and think, oh, she's been in this for years and years, she has all this experience. She couldn't possibly have gone through the mental process of evaluating international opportunities as a young person, and it's easier for her to talk about this than for us. But what about you, if you wish to share the story of how you got into the sort of the international side of the world, and what was your first experience in another country, and how did it affect you?
Yeah, so kind of two critical experiences that I had. First, as a very young person, so I grew up right outside of Detroit, Michigan, and across the river, the Detroit River, is Windsor, Canada. And my grandparents had a summer cottage on Lake Erie, and we would spend our summers traveling back and forth to Canada for just summer vacations. And that was kind of my first exposure to being in a different country on a regular basis. As a young person, I always noticed that all the signs were in French and in English, and so it kind of whetted my appetite for things international. And then at the age of 14, I didn't grow up in a hugely international environment with a lot of experiences, but at the age of 14, I had an opportunity, just a friend of the family provided an opportunity for me and some of my siblings to travel to Sweden to play basketball for a month. And I lived with a host family and just had an amazing experience of really being in an immersive experience in Sweden with all kinds of young people from around the world. And that was really probably the turning point for me of wanting more of those types of experiences, because though a lot of differences in the people that we were interacting with, that finding that common ground and common approach to how do you play basketball was really fun for me. And so after that, I pursued learning languages, French language in particular, and I had the ambition to teach and open other people's minds and perspectives to other cultures.
In the United States, historically, we were, for a long period of time, very Eurocentric because of the origins of many of the people who settled here and the colonial entities before that. But now it seems that other parts of the world are of greater interest, or at least people are told that they should be. And I think they should be. But I'm also of the opinion that we shouldn't forget or neglect any part of the world,
Right.
because it's all part of the mosaic.
That's right.
How do you encourage young people to go to places that might be outside of their comfort zones, and at the same time others who are really adventurous and want to go to different parts of the world, how do we persuade them that as at least one piece of the experience you visit, become aware of everything?
Yeah. So I have to say, when I was, in high school and even in university, I probably had, in high school I had 2 options to learn French or Spanish. And at the university level, I had probably 3 options of places where I could study abroad. Maybe I'm underestimating a little bit, but now I look at the opportunities that young people have, and it's incredible. I mean, young people going to Vietnam, going to Indonesia and China and the Middle East, and it's just, I look at even UCF's, University of Central Florida's opportunities and partnerships that they've developed with other countries and regions of the world that, do push students outside their comfort zones, more so than maybe Europe that's more familiar. That, I think just more of that exposure as much as possible, and for schools to help show and give that level of comfort that there's a support network in those countries, and that it could be even more interesting in certain parts of the world that just are less familiar to Americans. So I'm so inspired by the amount of opportunities that there are, and I think young people are just getting more and more adventurous, which is great to see.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. At what point is it appropriate to start introducing these international components as a part of education, whether it's cultural learning or foreign language learning? And there's a lot of debates over this, but it seems that young people are in the best possible position to learn other languages versus starting at a later time, and are naturally curious about everything. And so why not start in the first grade?
Absolutely. So I'll give an example of my son, who's 10 years old now. He goes to a bilingual school. It's a Washington, D.C. public school, Spanish and English, that started at pre-K, goes through 8th grade, and half the day is spent in English, half the day is spent in Spanish. And as one of the sort of extracurricular activities that they have available is they take all the 8th graders on a trip to Spain. And they do that in a way where they can make it affordable for all students, because you have a wide range of socioeconomic representation in that school. And how they go about it is doing fundraisers, kind of a GoFundMe campaign where friends and family provide resources for every one of the students in the 8th grade to go and spend 10 days in Spain. And I look at that as an example of what a wonderful opportunity for young people to take the language learning that they're doing as part of their curriculum and going to another location where they can, really utilize the language skills, but also from a cultural perspective, give them the appetite to be curious and to compare perspectives of what it's like to live in Washington versus Sevilla, Spain, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think the younger that we're integrating these experiences, and it doesn't always have to be about traveling abroad. There's a lot of there are a lot of exchange programs that really make an effort to provide opportunities of international people to spend time in classrooms, for example, and teach about their culture. And the more we can, introduce global perspectives into the classroom at very young ages, I think that's the best way to go about it.
One thing I've personally enjoyed over the years is when we've had the opportunity to welcome educators from other countries who are teaching in the same subject area.
Yeah.
And I've had educators from Germany, for example, who have sat in on some of my Middle Eastern studies courses. And that's not the typical sort of
Right.
thing that you think about when you imagine these situations, but and their teaching methods are very different. The techniques, the tools and all of that. But what's interesting is in all of these cases, whether it was German educators or educators from elsewhere, we found that we arrived at the same place in terms of what the students learned. But it was interesting to compare techniques, and in some cases I found ideas that I adapted to the classroom and vice versa.
Yeah.
And you don't think going into it that that might be one of the results, but it often is.
Absolutely. I think we all become wiser, smarter by these exchange experiences, that we can add more tools to our toolkit to see how other people approach their professions, their sector, and it's just such an enriching opportunity. And I think you really have to go in with it with the perspective of, I can really learn from this person, and their ways of approaching the subject matter, teaching the subject matter, though different, there are approaches that could actually really benefit the way I go about this, and I think that's the beauty of these programs.
I agree, and many years ago I was a student at Georgetown University, and I had a wise professor and advisor who said to me, reach out, talk to people, and this was pre-internet, but still you could reach out and I'm not saying this to be disruptive, but there's positive disruption as well as negative. And I tried that a couple of times with some very hard to reach professors at Ivy League institutions in the Northeast, and then I started trying it with people in other countries, and it did work. What are some recommendations that you would make as we try to look to the future of this chaotic, rapidly changing world that by reasons of political change, technology, and so many other things can just veer in so many different directions? What is the best way to be prepared for that in terms of the skill set that you have? And you've mentioned, internships and long-term and short-term international experiences, but are there specific skills that a student should try to acquire so that he or she can really make the best use of this environment and be prepared for the challenges?
Yeah, so the skills, I think about this a lot because we're always kind of assessing what happens with our participants through the experience, and I would put them in a couple different categories. One is the whole notion of adaptability, being able to put yourself in a very uncomfortable position and find ways to adapt to it. I would also say the ability to communicate across kind of borders, if you will, not necessarily physical borders, but cultural borders. The whole element of navigating difference. As you described your experience of, the difference of teaching styles, and, having that open mind to integrate into what your worldview is. A different type of worldview is critically important. And then I'd also say that, we talk a lot about innovation and entrepreneurship. You have to be pretty entrepreneurial to figure out how to intern or study abroad and look at a whole bunch of different options, figure out what's best for you, and then make the most of that experience. And, as I was saying earlier, I think we have to embrace the world of change and chaos, and the more comfortable we can get with it by practicing it, practicing changing your environments and changing your perspectives on a regular basis, I think will really equip people for the future.
If you had one wish that you could snap your fingers and make come true about the world in which we live, or the way we see it, or the way we understand it, or try to make our way through it. What would that be? Is it something necessarily complex, or could it be something very simple?
I think it's simple in, I look at some of the trends happening now, particularly this retreat from engagement, from global engagement, particularly happening in the US, and kind of a fear of the other, a fear of, an other taking away from me, and really trying, I wish we could help, or not even help, but to turn that mindset to more of the opportunity. What is the opportunity for me by, having new refugees or immigrants coming into this country, into my community? It's a big opportunity for me, not what is it that they're going to take away. And I'm concerned that we're just going down a path of fear of the other that was very prominent back in the 1950s. And how did we get to that place? And I really want us to move away from it and more towards how do I embrace other perspectives and integrate them in a way that can be a value add to me versus that's just going to be detrimental to me. And
Well, I think you've helped us move in that direction today, and we thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer Clinton.
thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.